Good evening. Oh, you're learning. Good. That's great. It's the greatest thing in the world to be a Christian. 7 people tonight believe that is true. Let's try that one more time. It is the greatest thing in the world to be a Christian. Yes, it is. Are we getting up there? Yes, we are. Okay. Let's see if you can remember what we did yesterday as well. You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depths of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above. And I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due. I stand in awe of you. Be seated, please. John Paul, you don't look like the twin brother of Matt. That's the way Leah introduced you. Of course, she's the same woman that didn't know when they met. You know, when they first married yesterday, so now she knows. And she knew then. It's just I kind of got her off guard. So understand that their daddies were partly responsible for them getting together, and they're a good couple. And John Paul, you have a set of pipes on you, dude. And you're a good song leader. You don't like to drag, do you? I can appreciate that. Yeah. All right, so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a lesson that I don't know if you've heard or not before, but it's a lesson about self-love, actually. It's a lesson about coming into a relationship with yourself. You might think, no, I'm not talking about that. But I am talking about the fact that sometimes we used to preach, Brother Perry, we used to preach sermons on joy. Jesus first, others second, yourself last. You know, in one sense, that ain't fully scriptural. And the reason why is that's not what Jesus teaches in Matthew 22. He doesn't teach Jesus first, others second, yourself last. He teaches God is first, others are second, as you also are second. Love others as you love yourself. Not more than, not before than. When I was a kid, the preacher always got the best pieces of chicken because he always went through first. And the kids back then always went last. Imagine that. The kids always went last. So we got necks and wings. That's pretty much what we got because the best pieces of chicken were already taken up. Well, let me tell you, I thought about that as a kid, and I thought this preaching thing, you know, it could work. You know, it's possible. It could, okay, so I grew up, become a preacher, and then what? Well, kids go first. Okay, so now the kids go first. But let me just tell you, you're not always last. I think it's a major problem today. It's a major problem of why some kids say yes when they ought to be saying no, and why some kids say no when they ought to be saying yes. It's a problem with adults sometimes when they ought to be saying no, they're saying yes, and they're saying yes when they should be saying no because they don't feel good about who they are. One of the things, talking with Randy yesterday about cancer and stuff, this is not going to be a cancer sermon per se, but it did go along with what I wanted to do anyway, and that is my personal relationship, Christ over cancer. One of the things that we talked about is that, you know, everything has a sense of newness to it once you hear the C word. Once you've heard the C word, like you remember probably the exact place, the exact time when you heard some doctor use that word in reference to you. And then all of a sudden, things begin to change. I was talking to a friend on the phone today. Things begin to change. Your relationships change a little bit. They become richer and dearer. You find out that things don't mean as much to you anymore. You know, because when I was let me just tell you, I used to never drive a car that was over 100,000 miles, and now I'm driving one that's 162,000, and if I get stuck somewhere, I'm going to call John Paul because they got wreckers. Okay, but the point is that I happen to understand that, you know, it just doesn't matter that much anymore. I want a car to get me from point A to point B. I do have a motorcycle, but it's on Craigslist if you're interested. All right, so when you talk about things that are not so important to you anymore, my wife put a thing on the window in our bathroom which says, each day is a special gift from God. Well, she's not here tonight because she's not feeling well. The last treatment, it kind of accumulates, and the last one was pretty tough. And so we go for a CAT scan tomorrow, et cetera, as Matt said, and then we go see the oncologist on Wednesday to see what has happened to the tumor during the time she's been taking she's been taking the chemo treatments. But it is literally true. I don't care how many people with cancer tell you this, but it's also true that it helps you to deepen your sense of who you are in relationship to others about you. You shall love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is the vertical. And the horizontal is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now the vertical is always the vertical. The vertical is always first, which means you got one finger pointed at somebody else, you got three fingers pointing back at you, which means consider your own relationship with God. If you're struggling with your wife, how is your spiritual life going? Are you happy with who you are in the face of God? For instance, I've given up the idea of weighing 175 pounds. I hadn't weighed 175 pounds since I was in the second grade, I guess. Okay, and so when you think about weighing 175 pounds, that's probably not going to happen. I tell you what's probably not going to happen either. My eyes, Ben, are probably not going to straighten. You know, my eyes are off about 9 degrees, and I have this condition called isolated exotropia. He can tell you afterwards what that is. But basically it means that sometimes my eyes don't exactly work together. I also, by the way, have a pilot's license. If anybody is flying with me, I kind of play a little trick on them and say, which one of those runways do you want us to land on? Okay, because when I get tired, my eyes can go, yeah. Okay, so I can see 2 runways. Okay, and then you say, wow, man. But you know what that meant? That meant when I was 16 years old, I could not go to the Air Force and be a fighter pilot. That's what it meant. It meant that I couldn't do that. My feet are flat. I got one eye that's a little lower than the other one, and one ear that's a little lower than the other one. And you know what encourages me? I look at you, and you ain't perfect either. You know, and so when I see all the imperfections of all of us that are out there, then we see, well, how do we come to a point to where we can actually love others as we love ourselves? Because if you don't feel good about who you are, it will negatively impact the relationship with your spouse. I guarantee it. If you don't feel good about who you are, it will negatively impact your relationship with your spouse. It will negatively impact the relationship with your children. Because you don't feel good about what you are, and sometimes you try to compensate through your children because you don't feel good about something that's going on with you. And so, as you love yourself, it's scriptural. Jesus first, the vertical is always the vertical, which means if I'm having a problem with a relationship in my life, I should always say, okay, is there something going on with me? Have I violated some principle of God? Am I close to the Lord? Am I doing what Jesus said to do in the Sermon on the Mount? You know, whatever sorts of things you need to bring to your mind. Remember, it is the spiritual. It's always first. There's an old Abbott and Costello, deal out there from years ago, even before I was born, about who's on first and what's on second. Well, God is always on first. He is always on first. It doesn't matter what else happens to you. He's always on first. And if you put God on first, then it helps you to see the horizontal relationships in your life. Loving others as you love yourself. And so, when we talk about Christ over cancer, here are principles, 5 of them from Romans chapter 8. By the way, if you are a computer sort of person, Elijah, then you may have this because it is now saved to the iPad here. And if you bring a jump drive or something, then you may have this presentation. Just don't put it on the internet. I'll be glad for you to use it for personal reasons any way that you want to. Church secretary, I don't know where you are. I'm probably adding something new for you to do. But if you want a copy of this, then you may have it. Okay, so when we talk about that, that means then Christ, number 1, I am not condemned because of my sin. Romans 8 and verse 1. All right, why? Because no one condemns me. Here recently, they've had some trouble with some of the euthanizing drugs. Because some of them have not happened. Like, for instance, the case in Oklahoma recently where there was a botched capital punishment and the euthanizing drugs didn't work. Here recently, Tennessee has floated a bill saying that if we don't have the drugs available, it does take several drugs in order to do that. If we don't have the drugs available, then the electric chair is an alternative. But basically, the point is this. I am on death row. That's where I am. As soon as I became a sinner, I am on death row. Now that means that I am the one. Now, don't judge it by the United States of America. If you're on death row in the United States of America, there's a 2% chance that you will die over a 14-year period. Because we don't do capital punishment the way they do in some countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and places like that. And they really, you could be dead by sundown, if you have committed certain crimes in areas like that. So I'm on death row, and I'm going to die. Now what's going to happen? Well, I was condemned, and Jesus came forward, and He paid the price for me. A couple of times in my life, I've been to places where the slaves were let off the slave ships. One I'm thinking of is Nassau. Downtown Nassau, there's an emancipation area there where that is a place where the ships would land to bring the slaves from the west coast of Africa, and they would land there. All right, so what does that mean? That means that everyone here is owned by somebody else, and there's going to be bought by somebody else, like a cow, like a horse. Going to be bought by someone else. And so they parade down this long walkway that led to the sea. And people along the way would maybe feel their arms or look at their teeth and see how healthy they were, to see if indeed they would be a good investment. That happened in downtown Nassau. That also happened in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, where they have a similar place where the slave ships would come in, and in that situation, they were being bought. Man, I was a slave to sin. I really was a slave to sin, and Jesus removed the death penalty for me and instead gave me the same life that He promised to the woman at the well in John 4. He gave me this life, this wonderful opportunity to have life. It's great to be able to do that. Sometimes our hearts are touched when we hear about someone, I know of someone, a preacher friend, who gave one of his kidneys to a distant cousin, and just so that his distant cousin might live. That means the rest of his life he's got one kidney, and he may be and probably will be okay, but it also means there's a reason why there's redundancy there. Most people can do better with two kidneys. But he gave one. Now, this is not like giving a kidney. This is like giving your life and saying, I will sit in the chair, that electric chair for you. I will lay on that gurney. I will lie on that gurney as you administer those drugs to me. I will do that for you. So number one, I'm not condemned. Does a cancer victim need to hear this? Absolutely. Because whenever you start feeling mortal, you start thinking these thoughts of all the bad stuff you've done. I stole a watermelon out of so-and-so's patch, and I stole some apples off of so-and-so's tree. It used to be the case, Russell, that people would call preachers to the hospital in order to kind of make their peace. And that means they're going to be confessing a lot of stuff that they probably should have taken care of 50 years ago. But there they are in the hospital confessing stuff to the preacher because they know their time has about come to an end. Now that's not so much a tradition now as it used to be, but I've had calls from just random people who wanted a preacher, and so there you are at the hospital listening to them as they try to make peace with their Creator. Okay, here's one of the things that you're going to have to deal with, cancer or not. You are terminal. You are mortal, and you are going to die. Even if the doctor says that wonderful word, which is remission, I want you to remember that word remission is the same word for remission of sins. If a doctor says to you your cancer's in remission, that doesn't mean that you're not going to die. That just means you don't have cancer right now as far as they can tell. But you know what else you're going to need, which is more important than remission of the cancer, is remission of your sins. Number two, I need to feel good about who I am because in me lives the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ, and the Holy Spirit, and they are in me as an incentive for me to live better. In other words, the presence of God is in my life, and He's in yours too. One of the things that I think that we are afraid of talking about, guys, and I know have done the open forum for a few years at Freed Hardeman, and we have this perennial discussion about whether or not the Holy Spirit lives in us through and only through the Word, or if the Holy Spirit lives in us personally. And sometimes I just want to say, gag a maggot. I'm so tired of talking about this. I mean, do you believe, for instance, that God is with you in your life? Well, you ought to, because He promised that He would be with you always, even to the end of the world. Do you believe that God is with you? Do you believe in the presence of God? If you were to ask some of the students at Freed Hardeman, for instance, do you believe that God is with you as a college student? They would look at you as though you had hit them with a brick. I don't know what you're talking about, because we didn't talk about that at my church. At our congregation, we didn't talk about the presence of God in our lives. Well, you should have. And why should you not have? Because if it's like Joseph. Most of the things that Joseph did were providential and not miraculous. He did, by the way, miraculously interpret some dreams. But most of the stuff that he did was the providence of God working in his life. And you know what even the jailers figured out about Joseph? Wow, God is with him. If you believe that God is with you, people around you can tell. And sometimes Bible studies will not have to be set up artificially because somebody will ask you where you go to church. Somebody will ask you about this. Why? Because, wow, it's kind of like I was flying back, I think it was the last time I was in Fresno. And I was flying back and I was so tired and I was looking forward, to some sleep, the long flight back to Memphis and all this stuff. And I sat next to this old woman that had been rode hard and, well, let me just say she had some wrinkles. Okay, and she'd been around a while. And then I didn't want to talk. I was tired of talking. I'd spoken a lot. And I was tired of talking. And then she told me she was an IRS auditor. And I thought, I really don't want to talk to you. I mean, there's like no reason why I should want to talk to you. And then she started maybe she was in her 65, 70 range. She just started pouring out this story about the regrets that she had as a married woman and her husband. They weren't able to get together. And she was trying to go to Georgia to reconcile with some of her daughters, and she'd had a tough life, and her kids struggled in their relationship with their mother and all that stuff. And then she just started to cry. I mean, this weathered woman, who was an auditor, just broke down in the seat next to me, and I'm thinking, oh, snipe. And I'm thinking, now what in the world? And it's like sometimes it's like you wear this sign that says, talk to me. My wife and I just say, well, I must have had my sign on today, because this random person on the elevator, or this random person at the market, or wherever just comes up and starts to talk to you. Now, why does that happen? I'm not saying it's miraculous. Did you hear me say that? I'm not saying that's miraculous. But people don't generally approach other people with things like that unless they feel that you are approachable. And one of the things that makes you approachable is that you understand that God is with you. Why? Because the word Emmanuel means God with us. If you have Jesus in you, then God is with you. And so we find in Romans chapter 8, in verses 9 through 12, we find that the Spirit of God lives in us, the Spirit of Christ lives in us, and the Holy Spirit lives in us. And whether I have cancer and I have a negative sort of diagnosis, or whether I don't have cancer and I think everything is fine, it is still nonetheless true that you need to be aware of the presence of God in your life. And you know what else you need to do? You need to talk to your children about how you came to the Lord. Because many of them struggle with that, and they don't know exactly. I do it at Freed Hardeman. I'm not a licensed counselor. Did you hear me say I'm not a licensed counselor? I'm not a licensed counselor. Ronnie, some of you guys are licensed and stuff, and I'm not a licensed counselor, but I've done a lot of it over the years, and I know that a lot of girls have come into my office and they have said, there's just nothing I can do to please my mother. It doesn't matter what it is that I do. If I do this, it's wrong. If I do this, it's wrong. It seems like almost an epidemic. And then the boys come in. I want to be close to my dad. But he's a working man. And when he's a working man, what do? My dad was a carpenter. When I left to go to Freed Hardeman, everything was pretty cool. And then I went back home for two reasons. Home cooking and to get my clothes washed. And I went back home, and it was 110 miles away in Middle Tennessee from Freed Hardeman. It was a long way from me. I'd never been that far away from home in my life. And so now it's Sunday afternoon. It's about 2:30 or 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon. It's time to get in the car. By the way, which was a 57 Chevy. Okay, it's time to get in the car and go back to Freed Hardeman, because now it's time to get back in time to go to church in Henderson. Okay, so you hug your mother. All right? And then you look. And there's your dad. What do you do with your dad? I never saw my mother and dad kiss but one time. And that's when my dad thought he had cancer. He was in the hospital, St. Thomas Hospital in Nashville. They were both in their 60s, and he pecked her on the cheek. Now, by the way, they were married for 59 years before my mother died in 1992. So I'm assuming there was some kissing in there somewhere. Well, at least there were 2 kids. Okay, so I'm assuming there was some kissing, but we never saw it because, man, our family was not touchy-feely. And then I married, some of you knew J.A. Thornton or Gene Thornton. He was my father-in-law and preached for many, many years in Mississippi. And then I visited Joyce's home in Boonville, Mississippi for the first time. Well, it was New Albany, Mississippi at that time. Okay, and I visited there, and Brother Thornton would, he'd go out there and go to the post office and come in and kiss Sister Delphia. That's his wife. Okay, and then he'd go out there and mow the yard, sometimes with a tie on, because he was a preacher. All right, and then he'd come in and he'd kiss Sister Delphia. And then he'd go outside and tinker around for a while in the garage, and he'd come in and he'd kiss Sister Delphia. And I'm watching all this, and I'm just thinking, I'm marrying into a family with a hormone imbalance. I mean, there is like no reason for you to kiss a woman that much. I mean, why in the world would you do that? And then God gave us 4 daughters. Because I had one sister, but she was 13 years older than I. And we became great friends when I grew up. But remember, she was 13 when I was born. And so we didn't become very close at that time. But I've thought about this a lot. I've thought about the fact that we sometimes bring up our kids in an emotionally tight environment where they cannot express their feelings. They are not allowed to touch us or hug us, or what do you do with a daddy doll, as I'm thinking of one of the writers used to say. If you have a mama doll, you know what you can do with a mama doll. What do you do with a daddy doll? And so I'm saying to you to teach your children about the presence of God in their lives and allow them to approach you. Even at times, they might say some things that might not necessarily be easy for you to deal with. But it is better for you to do that than to remain emotionally distant and carry that and pass it on to the next generation. Number 3, I am an heir of God and a joint heir with Christ. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, he and his wife just gave $125 million to the San Francisco school system. Well, let's see if I can do some quick math. He's worth about $40 billion, and he gave $125 million. So 40 times 8, that's less than 0.5% of the money that he has. And he gave away $125 million. Some guy is apparently going to buy the LA Clippers for $2 billion. Where in the world did they get that money? Sam Walton used to drive an old blue and white 1978 Ford pickup truck, which he drove, by the way, the rest of his life. When he started this store out in Arkansas, Bentonville, in the early 1960s, wouldn't you like to have had a couple of $1,000s to invest in the success of that little store, which became Walmart? You know, you can beat that. I don't care how good your investments are looking, you can beat that. Well, what can you do? You can die a Christian. Because when you die a Christian, you are an heir of God and a joint heir with Christ. That means, well, I'm facing problems here. I don't understand it all. I can't tell you all this. I know that in 2010, my wife had colon cancer, stage 1. One little polyp was taken out. They didn't give her chemotherapy because it's not supposed to spread. 99% of the time, it doesn't spread. But she's in the 1%. And the first words when they found out is, you have a 20% chance of living 5 years. Well, thank you for just blurting that out there. Thank you for just laying it out so that we can all understand exactly how serious this is. Well, yes, it's serious. But so is life in general, especially when you consider the fact that, wow, I cannot get the U-Haul connected to the back of the hearse. What are you going to do with all of that money that you are making? One woman was married to a stingy man. And he would take his money and put it in a tow sack. Any of y'all know what a tow sack is? Okay, and you put it in that tow sack, and he would hang it on a big nail up in one of the rafters in the attic. Stuffed all that money in there, and just wouldn't give her hardly anything at all. Well, the stingy man died. And the woman went to the funeral, and when she came back home, she thought about that money in the attic. So she pulled down the stairs and went up in the attic, and there was that money still hanging there from that nail in that tow sack. You know what she said? I guess he should have hung it in the basement. All right, so you think about, can you take it with you? Nope, not that important. I've been in some places in California, Russell, where a house like I live in would cost $1.5 million. And you wonder, how in the world, or why in the world, do people get in that rat race? I owe. It's off to work I go. Until you are so knee-deep, neck-deep in debt that you cannot possibly figure out how this is all going to work. So instead, wouldn't it make better sense to make investments where bankers can't steal what you are trying to say? Where evil people, not all banks, some banks are good, but there are unscrupulous bankers who can get what you have. And therefore, there's where I want to put my money. Now that means, of course, with regard to Christ over cancer, this is the ultimate Christ over cancer. Because there is no insurance policy out there like this one. Let me tell you, my wife was supposed to have CAT scans today, but the insurance people got involved. And they said, well, she had CAT scans in March. Well, she did. And now the doctor says she wants some now. I don't particularly care for some insurance folks. Whenever you try to deal with that and you try to do the right thing and you pay all this money all these years, and then when you think, well, it's going to be fine because now we got insurance. Well, it might not be working out exactly the way that you think it does. And so, where is the ultimate insurance? Really simple. Become a Christian and die a Christian. Become a Christian and be faithful even if it requires death, and I will give you a crown of life. Number 4, God causes all things to work together for good. Now you got to listen to this, because the text does not say it'll all work out for my good. It doesn't say that. I thought about this passage a lot. Because in 1992, my one sister, who was 13 years older than me, was 54 years old, and I was 41. She got a particular fast-acting type of cancer, which they believe was associated with a sort of radon poisoning in her basement, by the way, after she died. It was tested, and it was 10 times higher than normal. So it may have been connected with radon poisoning. She had cancer for 33 days, and she died. 33 days. She had 11 days of symptoms. They diagnosed her on the 12th day, and on the 33rd day, she passed from this life. She was a great alto singer. Sometimes I hear it in the voices of my children. She sang as long as we could in the hospital, because that's what we did. Second Sunday singing in Murray County, fourth Sunday singing in Lawrence County. That's what we did growing up. We went to sing. And then the time came that she was in a coma and she couldn't sing any longer. And if somebody had said to me Romans 8:28 after she died, I think I could have got arrested for hitting them in the face. I'm pretty sure that I could have done that, because I don't want you telling me that somehow or another this works out to your good, that your sister died. And then 3 months to the day, my mother died. That was the worst semester of my time at Freed Hardeman. And then somebody, I know they mean well, and often they're brothers and sisters who care for you, but they come up and then just say something really stupid. Which means, this is good. Will you get out of my face? This is not good. I'm thankful, brother, for the ministry that you have here, Christ Over Cancer. Because there's a lot of people that are affected by that, and I got to think about this too. That is one way to do mission work and to improve visibility of the church, not only here, but in many places of the world where you've sent out over 1,500 copies of the book. I read that in your book yesterday. I'm thankful for that. But most of the people who have cancer are not going to be 20-something and 30-something. But this is one great way of outreach that other congregations have not done. And I praise you for it, because I read some of those articles. My wife has not felt like reading yet, but I read some of those articles yesterday of survivors. And the opening one meant a lot to me because Don Meyer, even though I didn't like him very much when he coached at Lipscomb and he always beat us at Freed Hardeman in basketball, I didn't care much for him then. But I knew that Don Meyer was a good man, because every summer when I was preaching in Knoxville, every summer when he'd bring his kids to the basketball camp, he would bring them to Bible study and to worship where I was preaching. And every time he'd send me a handwritten note thanking me for the ministry that we had going on at that small congregation at the Norwood Church of Christ. So I know he was a good man. He succumbed to cancer last week. Made it longer and farther than a lot of other people thought that he would. But it is still true that whenever you read this passage, read it right. For we know what? God causes all things to work together for good. That doesn't say you're good necessarily. It doesn't mean that your prayers are going to be answered necessarily. I went through a time I didn't want to pray. My sister's death was connected to my daughter the next year, who went to Freed Hardeman and then began experimenting with stuff off campus. She began to drink and use drugs and stuff, and a lot of it was due to the fact that she was saying to herself, if you really cared for me, God, why would you remove my favorite aunt from my life during my senior year in high school? Why would you do that? So read the passage carefully. It doesn't say that it will necessarily be the answer to your prayers. You may not get what you're praying for. But what you will get is God's ear listening to you, and the fact that somehow or another there'll be a larger scope of good that can be accomplished. But it doesn't mean that God touched your sister or your mother or your spouse and said, it is time for you to die. Sometimes things happen because in the natural course of things, remember, we live in a temporary environment, and at some point, the real smart people with ologist at the end of their name are not going to know what to do to help your loved one. It may be a pneumatologist or an oncologist or a radiologist or some other ologist, but at some point, they won't be able to help you anymore. Because we live in a period of time now where we are on probation. Yes, you are. On probation. What does that mean? I'm here for a time, and I don't know how much time. By the way, that's to your advantage. If you did know the exact time of your death, then you could falsely come to the Lord and do one of those 11th hour things and have somebody baptize you in a bathtub at some place, in a motel or whatever. I'm not going to say that they're not going to take, but it is a little suspicious that you didn't do this until you felt that you were going to die. And so the wise man Solomon says, remember now your Creator when you have all your teeth. I'm going to rephrase that. Remember now your Creator when you can get up on a ladder and not be afraid of heights, because you're not afraid of falling and breaking your hip or your leg. Remember your Creator when your arms are long enough to read from the songbook without glasses. Before the presbyopia sets in, which means old eyes, and your arms are no longer long enough, and so I could say, Russell, would you hold this book for me so I can, and then at some point, you got to get glasses. Remember God during the good days. He deserves that. And if you haven't done that, that doesn't mean that you can't come to the Lord tonight, but it does mean that you missed some wonderful opportunities in order to make some influences on your family. And what else do I learn? God is on my side. You can't see this. There's a text problem there. And He loves me unconditionally. Loving me unconditionally. What does that mean? Well, God loves me unconditionally. If the doctor says remission, if the doctor says relapse. Whichever R word He uses, He loves me. And the most important thing that He could do for me was to give His Son so that I might live with Him eternally in a place where there is no cancer, and it will not be a place of probation. Because when you go there, you will be there. If you go to heaven, that's where you're going to be. If you go to hell, that's where you're going to be. One passage in Revelation 20 says that there will be no tears. And another passage in Revelation 21 says that He will wipe the tears from their eyes. Sometimes people wonder, well, what's the difference there? The passage never really promises, by the way, you won't have earthly tear ducts or an earthly face. But it doesn't mean that you won't have any bad memories at all, but it does mean that God's going to delete, erase those memories. So that whatever it takes for you to be happy in heaven, you will be happy in heaven. But sometimes it's not going to work out the way that you think. You see, if we don't follow these 5 positive principles here and come to love ourselves, then another thing can happen to us which is really ugly. And I'm going to call it the negative cycle of negative self-esteem. I don't feel good about who I am. Well, why do you think there's so much plastic surgery? Why do you think there are so many other elective surgeries? People don't feel good about who they are. I'm not saying that they're sinful. I'm just saying there are reasons why they are plentiful. And so, I'd preached this sermon before, and that is the negative cycle. I don't feel good about who I am, so I began to expect others to look at me the way that I feel about myself. When I expect that from others, they bounce back what I expect them to bounce back, because that's what I think they're going to do. If I think I'm fat, I think that they're going to think that I'm fat. And sure enough, I see that they view me in this way. And then because I don't feel good about who I am, I begin to act up, to do things, to anesthetize the way that I feel. Maybe it's sex, or drugs, or alcohol. Maybe it's gambling, or some other addictive disorder. But somehow or another, I need relief from this way that I feel about myself. And therefore, I began to enter a world of the dark side. And by the way, it gets darker. In the 7 years that our daughter was on drugs, we thought, okay, this is as far as she will go. And then we would say, this is as far as she will go. And I guarantee you that any of your children, if they want to do so, can go farther than you think they would. So, after several rehab treatments and thousands of dollars and not a lot of positive things happening, connected in negative relationships, our daughter, who graduated from Jackson Christian School, our daughter, who went to Freed Hardeman, and one semester had a 3.0, our daughter starts with drugs and alcohol. She was adopted. It is true that her birth mother OD'd at least twice while she was carrying her, according to records at West Tennessee Agape. It's also true that her birth father had some alcoholism issues. And so she got a double whammy from her birth parents. We got her when she was 5 weeks old. We couldn't figure out why she wouldn't stop crying. Sometimes she'd be just fine, just absolutely peaceful. And then she'd go into a rage, and it would seem like nothing would help her. We believe that she was coming off drugs. She wasn't given a level playing field by genetics. I do believe that there are certain genetic markers that make some people susceptible to alcoholism more than others. But I do remember when she was in jail for a couple of years, she said, Dad, can you bring a group from church and that was the Campbell Street Church of Christ. Can you bring a group of people for Christmas time? And I said, yes, honey, we can. Because those calls were terrible. Yeah, they get one call a couple days a week. And they're usually always crying. If my wife couldn't take it, then I'd try to take the call. If I couldn't take it, I'd let my wife take the call. But I said to her, what do you want me to preach about? She said, Dad, I want you to preach that sermon about Jesus breaks the cycle. That negative cycle that you get into. Let's call it cancer of the mind. Because it eats away at you. It makes you do bad things when you know better. You've been taught better. You really understand better. But at some point, your body craves drugs more than it craves even food itself. She got super skinny. And about 25 or 30 of us from Campbell Street got permission to go into the jail, and I preached the sermon about Jesus breaks the cycle. Why? Because most all of those women in that prison feel bad about who they are. And I've also noticed that's true often in the church. A lot of us feel bad about who we are. And so I want you to break it. I want you to break it. It's been 13 years and 3 months that my daughter now has been sober. She now teaches DUI classes for people who come to her from the court system. And she's working as an alcohol and drug addiction counselor at a place where court-appointed people come for having problems with drugs. Just go figure. All those years of struggle, and she couldn't seem to do anything to help herself until finally she let God help her. And now, she's helping others. And so the message to you is this. I want you to read these passages from Romans 8. When you're feeling bad about your spiritual relationship with God, they are there for a reason. They're in the sanctification portion of the book of Romans, which is Romans 6, 7, and 8. They're there to help you to feel better about the spirit of grace that you have in Christ Jesus. And if you begin to feel better about who you are, you'll be amazed that your spouse even begins to look better too. I know it's hard to believe. It's even possible for your spouse to look a little better too. Well, I guess you know that cancer has brought my wife and I closer together. And in some respects, I regret having to be here tonight. But the message is worth it, and I'll be going home afterwards. But I don't want you to leave tonight without feeling that maybe there's some providential reason why some of you are here. Because some of you are passing along this negative thinking to your children. Some of you have this negative thinking with your spouse. And you need to come out of that, because Jesus did not die on the cross so that you would feel bad about who you are. Yes, I've not conquered the weight thing. And there are a lot of things that I haven't conquered. But after a heart attack in 2001, it occurred to me, I'm going to stop being so negative about myself. I'm going to stop it. And so, for you, I hope that God is bringing you something tonight that will help you to be a better person. That will help you, and it's not too late. If you didn't do it well with your own children, there are those grandkids. Rent a kid. Man, they are great. Even if you didn't do it right with your own children, God, as long as you have breath and life, will give you the chance to make some of that right. You know what else? In the church, we sometimes have this idea that if somebody comes forward, they had to have done some big sin. That is so ridiculous. You should be able to come forward and just say, I need help. I want the prayers of this church. Why is it that we have to assume that somebody has to be caught in some negative situation? And so tonight, if there's something that these wonderful brothers and sisters can do together with you to help you in your spiritual struggle, in your struggle with yourself, and in your struggle with your relationships, don't you dare forget how much God loves you. Rose is staying home tonight with my wife. She's 22 now. She was about 4 then. And so she was about to go to bed and had a prayer with her. And she said, Rose, you know that I'm always going to love you. She said, I know that, Daddy. Well, you're 4 years old. How can you know that? I don't even understand unconditional love myself at my age. How do you know that? And she said, because you've always loved my sister Jenny. While we stand and sing.